If this HOA had a theme song, it'd be a snarky little ditty called "You Don't Own What You Bought." They slapped me with a $500 fine for parking my legally docked boat, then turned around and threw a wild Chardonnay-fueled rager on it, like they were channeling Beyoncé on her world tour. I kid you not. These folks invent committees faster than teenagers, dream up excuses, and I've somehow become public enemy number one just for daring to crack open the bylaws. Suburbia isn't the peaceful haven it promises. It's polite chaos dressed up with manicured lawns. Ever been fined for something absurd? Drop a comment below and share the madness. I need proof I'm not the only one battling this wine-drunk
HOA monarchy. It all kicked off on a Tuesday morning when I found that outrageous fine plastered across my front door like some garish legal graffiti.
That bright yellow notice practically screamed at me through the glass, and I could feel my neighbors' eyes boring through their curtains, likely snapping pics for the community forum. The fine claimed my boat violated some mysterious rule I'd never encountered in my 3 years in this upscale lakeside paradise. But the real shock hit when I strolled down to the community dock to check on my $20,000 fishing boat. Wine stains were splattered across the deck like someone had thrown an uninvited bash on my pride and joy. That boat meant the world to me. As an independent boat mechanic who once kept the local marina humming, I'd scraped and saved every penny for 2 years to buy her. I still recall the day I first saw her, those sleek lines, faded paint, and just enough rust to deter anyone without a dreamer's heart. She was my weekend refuge, my therapy after the divorce, something I could mend and master when the rest of life felt shattered. I knew her better than most, every bolt, every nuance. Which city of the United States are you watching from? Drop a comment and share with us if you have any confrontation with the HOA. We will narrate your story on our channel. Every scrape told a story. Seeing those wine stains felt like someone had walked into my house and trashed my living room. I ran my fingers along the stained fiberglass, feeling my jaw clench tighter with each purple splotch. I discovered that afternoon I marched straight to the HOA office, clutching the fine in my fist like a weapon. Meredith Lell sat behind her mahogany desk like some kind of suburban dictator, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the fluorescent light as she looked up from her computer. With that practiced smile that never reached her eyes, she was probably in her late 30s, dressed in a crisp white blouse that screamed, "I'm in charge." And when she saw me approaching with the fine, that fake smile widened into something almost predatory. "Mystery?" she chirped, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I was wondering when you'd stop by. I trust you received our notice about your boat violation." The way she said your boat made it sound like I was keeping a nuclear weapon on community property. I slammed the fine down on her desk, watching her flinch slightly despite her composed facade. "This says I'm violating regulations by parking my boat incorrectly, but I've been parking in the same spot for 3 years. What's changed?" Meredith's smile never wavered as she pulled out a thick folder. "Well, you see, our temporary oversight committee has implemented new guidelines for watercraft management. Your boat exceeds the aesthetic standards we're trying to maintain for our community." I felt my hands ball into fists as she spoke. Temporary oversight committee. I'd never heard of any such thing, and I'd read every HOA document. When I bought my house, what committee, who's on it? When was this voted on? My questions seemed to amuse her because she actually laughed. A sound like breaking glass. "Mystery? You don't need to worry about the administrative details. What you need to worry about is paying this fine within 7 days, or we'll be forced to have your boat removed from community property." The threat hung in the air between us like smoke, and I could see the satisfaction in her pale blue eyes that evening. My neighbor Stanley Doyle knocked on my door with a beer in each hand and a grim expression on his weathered face. Stanley was a good guy, an electrician in his early 40s who'd lived in the community longer than anyone, except maybe Meredith herself, heard about. "Your boat trouble," he said, settling into my porch chair with a grunt. "That woman's been gunning for you ever since you moved in." He took a long swig of beer and shook his head. "She did the same thing to the Johnsons with their RV and the Millers, with their vegetable garden, made up some temporary committee nonsense and fined them into submission." Stanley's words confirmed what I'd suspected. This wasn't about regulations at all. Why me, though I mind my own business, pay my dues on time, keep my property clean? Stanley gave me a look that was part sympathy, part warning. "You're a single guy with a nice boat who doesn't bow down when she starts barking orders in Meredith's world that makes you dangerous." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Even though we were alone on my porch, word is she had a brother who ran off to sail around the world, left her high and dry when their parents died. Ever since then, she's had it out for any man who owns a boat, especially guys like you who remind her of him." The next morning, Meredith showed up at my house uninvited, standing on my porch, like she owned the place she was wearing. Designer sunglasses despite the overcast sky, and her smile was sharper than a knife edge. "Beautiful boat you have down there, Mr. E. Such a shame when people don't quite fit into the community they've chosen." To call home, her words were carefully chosen, each one designed to cut. I stepped closer, close enough to see my reflection in her sunglasses. "Is that a threat?" She tilted her head like a curious bird. "Oh no, just an observation. Some people understand what it means to be part of a community, and others, well, others learn the hard way." As she walked back to her pristine, white SUV, I realized this wasn't just about a fine or some made-up committee. This was personal, and Meredith Lowell had just declared war on the wrong guy. I spent the rest of that day combing through every HOA document I could find, and guess what I discovered? There was no mention of any temporary oversight committee anywhere in our governing documents. This woman was literally making up rules as she went along, and I was about to become her biggest problem. She thought I'd just pay the $500 and slink away like a beaten dog. But Meredith was about to learn that I don't back down from a fight, especially when I'm in the right. 3 days after that confrontation with Meredith, I drove down to the community dock expecting to spend a peaceful evening cleaning my boat and maybe taking her out for a sunset cruise. Instead, I found what looked like a floating nightclub
had exploded across my deck. Electronic dance music was pounding from portable speakers. Colourful string lights were draped everywhere like Christmas had thrown up, and about 20 people were stumbling around my boat with drinks in their hand. I counted
3 people already in the lake, the dock slick with booze and someone's half-eaten dinner. My boat looked like a frat house, and Meredith stood at the centre, wine glass raised like she owned it. When she spotted me on the dock, she raised her glass in a mock toast and shouted over the music, "Clayton, so glad you could join us. I hope you don't mind. We're just making use of community property, community property." The words hit me like a physical blow. I pushed through the crowd of drunk strangers, my boots slipping on the wet deck as I tried to reach Meredith. "Get off my boat, all of you, get off right now." But my voice was drowned out by the music and laughter. A young guy in board shorts stumbled into me, beer sloshing from his red cup onto my shirt. "Hey man, chill out, the HOA lady said we could party here." I grabbed him by the shoulders, probably harder than I should have. "This is my boat. She had no right to tell you that." That's when I noticed the damage. The rope cleat had been loosened and retied incorrectly. The cushions were soaked with God knows
what. And someone had actually carved their initials into my mahogany steering wheel, the boat I'd babied for 3 years, the one I'd spent countless weekends maintaining and polishing, looked like it had been through a hurricane. I felt something snap.
Inside my chest, not just anger, but genuine heartbreak. This wasn't just property damage, it was a violation of everything I cared about. I pulled out my phone and started recording, pushing through the crowd while narrating what I was seeing. This
Is my boat registration number clearly visible right here? And these people are trespassing with the apparent permission of our HOA president. Meredith noticed me filming and immediately went into damage control mode, but it was too late. I'd already...
captured her, admitting that she'd given permission for this disaster. The evidence was piling up, and I made sure to get clear shots of every broken fixture and stain. Within 20 minutes, Deputy Glenn Carter arrived in response to my call. Carter was a solid guy in his mid-40s who'd been patrolling the lake area for over a decade. He took one look at the scene and started taking names and asking for identification when he approached. Meredith, her entire demeanor changed. Gone was the confident.
Hostess act suddenly she was just a confused woman who had no idea how this party had gotten so out of hand. Officer, I was just trying to help these young people find a safe place to gather. Mr. Ree had been so generous in the past about sharing.
His boat with the community, the lies rolled off her tongue so smoothly that I actually felt impressed, despite my fury. But Carter wasn't buying it, ma'am. Do you have written permission from Mr. Ree to use his personal property? Meredith's eyes darted around like a trapped animal's. Well, you see, according to our HOA regulations, when someone violates community standards, their property can be temporarily managed by the association. Carter looked at me, then back at Meredith. Do you have documentation of these regulations and this temporary management order? That's when things got really interesting. A woman I'd never seen before stepped forward from the crowd, late 20s, professional, looked with intelligent eyes that seemed to take
In everything, excuse me, I'm Rachel McKinley, Secretary of the HOA Board. I need to clarify something important. She looked directly at Meredith with barely concealed disgust. There was never any board authorization for this event, and Mr. Reese's property
was never transferred to community management. In fact, I have copies of emails where Mr. Reese specifically objected to any use of his boat, but those emails were blocked from reaching the rest of the board. Meredith's face went through about 6 different shades of red as Rachel spoke. Rachel, you're misunderstanding. The administrative process, the temporary oversight committee has full authority. What committee? Rachel interrupted. I've been secretary for 2 years, and there's no record of any temporary oversight committee being formed or authorized. The crowd was getting uncomfortable now, sensing that their fun evening was turning into something much more serious. Deputy Carter cleared his throat and addressed the party guests. Folks,
I need everyone off this boat immediately. This is private property and you're all trespassing. As people started gathering their belongings and stumbling toward shore, Carter turned to Meredith. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to provide documentation
for your claims about community property management, or I'll have to consider filing charges for allowing trespassing on private property. Meredith pulled out her phone and made a show of scrolling through emails. I'll have my husband send over the legal documentation. He's an attorney, you know. But I could see the panic in her eyes. She was stalling, hoping Carter would just let this slide rather than deal with paperwork. Unfortunately for her, Carter was the thorough type. He handed her his card and said, "Have those documents to me by tomorrow afternoon, or we'll be having another conversation." As the last of the party guests straggled away, I stood on my damaged boat looking at thousands of dollars in repairs that would need to be done. The deck was scratched, the upholstery was ruined, and the smell of spilled alcohol would probably take weeks to get out, but I had something more valuable than a clean boat. I had Meredith on record lying to a police officer, and I had a witness who could prove she'd been blocking my communications with the HOA board. That night I sat on my porch with Stanley, both of us nursing beers and watching the lights reflect off the lake. You know, she's not going to let this go. Stanley warned Meredith doesn't like being embarrassed, and you just embarrassed her in front of half the community. I took a long drink and smiled grimly. Good, maybe it's time someone showed this neighborhood that Meredith Lowell isn't as untouchable as she thinks she is 2 days after the boat party disaster. I found another official-looking envelope slipped under my door. This time, the fine had doubled to $1,000, issued by something called the Community Order Oversight Committee for Continued Violations and Disruptive Behavior. The letter threatened to have my boat physically removed from community property within 72 hours if I didn't pay immediately. I read that letter 3 times, each reading making my blood pressure spike higher than the last, but Meredith wasn't done with her psychological warfare. At exactly 8 hours that same morning, I heard the crackle of a megaphone outside my house because apparently humiliating people the old-fashioned way wasn't dramatic enough for her. I peeked through the blinds, and there she was standing dead center in the middle of our peaceful cul-de-sac like a dictator in heels. She had on a navy blue blazer and that smug HOA badge clipped to her lapel as if that made her the sheriff of Lakewood Hills. Her voice boomed through the plastic speaker. Attention residents of Lakewood Hills, please be aware that Clayton Rhee of 42 Maple Lane has been cited for multiple community violations and has refused to comply with lawful orders from your elected HOA board. Your property values are in danger. A dog barked, someone clapped, someone else gasped, and all I could do was stand there holding a mug of coffee I no longer wanted to drink, realizing I had just been publicly executed by a megaphone. The scene was so surreal I almost laughed. Here was a grown woman with a megaphone publicly shaming me, like some kind of town crier from the 1800s. But as I watched my neighbors come out of their houses and gather around her, I realized this wasn't funny at all. It was calculated humiliation designed to turn the entire community against me. Mr. Reese has shown a pattern of disregard for our community standards. Meredith continued, her amplified voice echoing off the houses. His actions threaten the property values and peaceful enjoyment that we all cherish here in Lakewood Hills. I threw on clothes and stormed outside, but by the time I reached the street, she'd already moved on to the next block. As I walked down the sidewalk, neighbors turned away like I was radioactive. Neighbors shut blinds, pulled their kids inside, and crossed the street to avoid me like I'd suddenly turned radioactive. It wasn't just social rejection, it was a calculated exile. Meredith had poisoned the well, and now I was the village plague. Mrs. Patterson from across the street actually crossed the other side when she saw me checking my mailbox. The isolation was immediate and complete. Meredith had poisoned the well of community goodwill in less than 10 minutes with a megaphone. That afternoon, I didn't have to call Rachel. She showed up at my door, hoodie, pulled up like she was in witness protection. "Can we talk somewhere quiet?" she whispered. 5 minutes later, we were in my garage, sitting on overturned paint buckets between a lawnmower and a stack of boat manuals I'd been trying to get the board to meet about all this, but Meredith keeps cancelling meetings and blocking agenda items. She said, pulling out a small recorder. She's been intercepting emails too. I've got proof she hit play. Meredith's voice spilled out the beauty of being HOA president.
Is that most people don't actually read the governing documents. They just assume you're allowed to make things up. I blinked. She actually said that? Rachel nodded grimly. Oh, you haven't heard the worst part yet. I've been trying to get the board
to meet about this situation, but Meredith keeps postponing meetings and controlling the agenda. She's been intercepting emails and phone calls, basically running the HOA like her personal kingdom. Rachel pulled up her hood like she was in witness protection and whispered, "Can we talk?" In my garage, she pulled out a small recorder and hit play. Meredith's voice filled the room. The beauty of being HOA president is that most people don't read the governing documents, they just assume you have. The authority you claim to have, Clayton Ree, is learning that lesson the hard way. My jaw dropped as I listened to her casual admission of abuse of power. "There's more," Rachel said, fast-forwarding through the recording she's been bragging about creating. "These fake committees and using official-sounding language to intimidate people into compliance. She calls it community management through strategic authority projection." The recording continued with Meredith laughing about how easy it was to manipulate homeowners who were too busy or intimidated to challenge her authority. Hearing her call me a problem resident who needed to be managed out wasn't just infuriating, it was intimate, like being stabbed by someone who studied your soft spots first. I looked at Rachel and said, "She's been playing chess, I've been playing checkers." I knew then what had to come next: surveillance documentation and a battle she wouldn't see coming. That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. I walked down to the community dock and spent 2 hours installing a high-definition security camera in a weatherproof housing position to monitor my boat from multiple angles. If Meredith wanted to play games with my property, I was going to make sure every move was documented. I also set up a secondary camera near the parking area disguised as a birdhouse that Stanley helped me mount on a nearby tree. The cameras proved their worth faster than I expected just after midnight. The motion sensors triggered, and I watched for my laptop as a figure in dark clothing approached. My boat, the infrared night vision clearly showed someone loosening the dock lines and tampering with the engine cover. I couldn't make out the face, but the person's build and movements looked familiar when they finished whatever they were doing. They walked directly to a white SUV parked in the shadows. The same white SUV that Meredith drove every day. The next morning brought a community-wide email from Meredith announcing a special assessment of $50 per household to fund enhanced security measures following recent incidents of property damage and disruptive behavior by certain residents. The email specifically mentioned my boat as an ongoing security concern and suggested that problem residents should consider whether they were truly compatible with community standards. Reading that email felt like watching someone dig their own grave. Every word was creating more evidence of harassment and abuse of power. I spent that entire day wavering between rage and desperation. Part of me wanted to just sell the boat and move away from this insanity, but another part of me refused to let Meredith win through intimidation. I sat on my deck that evening, staring out at the lake and feeling more isolated than I'd felt since my divorce. The community I'd chosen as my fresh start had turned into a battlefield, and I was losing badly. But as I reviewed the security footage one more time, something clicked into place. Meredith was so confident in her authority that she was getting sloppy. The midnight visit to my boat, the recorded admissions to Rachel, the fake committees she was creating, a paper trail of illegal activity while thinking she was untouchable. I opened my laptop and started typing an email to Deputy Carter, attaching video files and audio recordings. If Meredith wanted to escalate this war, I was about to give her more fight than she'd bargained for. Stanley knocked on my door around 9 and carrying his usual offering of cold beer and moral support. "Heard about the megaphone incident," he said, settling into the porch chair with a grunt. "That woman's lost her mind." I showed him the security footage on my laptop watching his eyes widen as he saw the midnight sabotage attempt. Holy hell. Clayton, you've got her dead to rights. But even as he said it, I could see the worry in his eyes. We both knew that having evidence and getting justice were two completely different things in a community where Meredith controlled the narrative. She thinks I'm just going to roll over and take this, I said, saving the video files to multiple backup drives. But Meredith? Lel has no idea who she's dealing with. I've been fixing problems with boats and engines for 15 years. I know how to diagnose what's broken and how to fix it. And right now, what's broken is the power structure in this community 1 week after the midnight sabotage incident. Meredith called for an emergency HOA meeting, ostensibly, to address ongoing security concerns and community disruption. The meeting notice distributed to every household specifically mentioned a proposal to remove persistent violators from community property access, and included my name as the primary example of someone who threatens our peaceful way of life. I knew this was her attempt to finish me off publicly, but I'd been preparing for this moment since I installed those security cameras. The community center was packed. That Thursday evening, I counted at least 60 residents filling every chair and lining the walls. The biggest turnout I'd ever seen for an HOA meeting. Meredith had clearly been working the phones and knocking on doors, rallying support for her cause. She stood at the front of the room in a charcoal business suit, looking every inch the professional administrator, with a presentation screen behind her and a stack of official-looking documents. On the podium, "Thank you all for coming tonight," Meredith began her voice, carrying that familiar tone of false concern. "We're here to address a serious situation that affects every one of us. Over the past month, we've documented multiple violations of community standards by one individual who seems determined to disrupt our peaceful neighborhood." She clicked a remote, and the screen behind her displayed a slideshow titled "Community Security Concerns, a Pattern of Violation." The presentation was a masterpiece of manipulation. She'd compiled photos of my boat from various angles, making it look larger and more intrusive than it actually was. She'd included screenshots of noise complaints, though I'd never received any noise complaints, and even security footage that appeared to show me aggressively confronting community members. I realized with growing horror that she'd somehow edited the boat party footage to make it look like I was the one causing problems rather than trying to stop them. As you can see, Meredith continued advancing through slides that painted me as some kind of neighborhood menace. "Mr. E has repeatedly ignored lawful orders from your elected HOA board. His boat exceeds size restrictions. His behavior has been consistently disruptive, and he's shown no willingness to comply with reasonable community standards." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and I could feel hostile eyes turning toward me as I sat in the back row. The presentation included testimonials from concerned residents, though the voices were distorted and no names were provided, describing my allegedly threatening behavior and property violations. One anonymous voice claimed I'd been revving my boat engine at all hours, while another said I'd been intimidating children who were just trying to enjoy the community dock. Every word was a lie, but the presentation was so professional and convincing that I could see my neighbors nodding along in agreement. When Meredith opened the floor for comments, the attacks came fast and brutal. One resident stood up and said, "I moved here for peace and quiet, not to deal with troublemakers who think rules don't apply to them." Another added, "If someone can't respect community standards, maybe they should find somewhere else to live." I sat there listening to my neighbors, people I'd waved to for 3 years, calling for my removal from the community based on complete fabrication. But I'd been preparing for this moment when Meredith finally called for a vote on her proposal to suspend community property access for persistent violators. I stood up and raised my hand. "Point of order, Madame President. before we vote on anything.
I believe the community deserves to see the complete picture of what's been happening here. I pulled out my laptop and the portable projector I'd borrowed from Stanley's electrical company. "Mr. Reese, you're out of order," Meredith snapped. But I was
Already connecting my equipment to the room's audio system. Actually, according to HOA bylaws, any member has the right to present relevant evidence before a vote that affects their property rights. I'd spent hours researching parliamentary procedure, and I knew exactly what I was doing. Several board members nodded reluctantly. They knew I was right about the rules, even if they didn't like it. My presentation started with the security footage of the midnight visit to my boat. The room fell silent. As they watched a figure in dark clothing tampering with my dock lines, then walking directly to Meredith's white SUV, the timestamp clearly showed this happening at 2:15 a.m., 3 days before Meredith's presentation about my security concerns. Then I played Rachel's audio recording of Meredith admitting to creating fake committees and manipulating homeowners through strategic authority projection. The reaction was immediate, and explosive residents started shouting questions at Meredith, demanding explanations for what they'd just seen and heard. "Is that your car in the video?" Someone called out, "Did you really say those things about fake committees?" Another voice, demanded Meredith, tried to regain control, claiming the footage was taken out of context and the audio was illegally recorded, but her face had gone pale and her confident demeanor was cracking. "There's more," I said, advancing to the next slide. I displayed the email thread where I'd repeatedly tried to contact the HOA board about reasonable compromises, only to have my messages blocked or ignored. Then I showed the fake fine notices with their references to non-existent committees and regulations that appeared nowhere in our governing documents. Every fine, every threat, every claim of authority, it's all been fabricated to harass me into leaving the community. Rachel McKinley stood up from her seat in the middle of the room. "I can confirm everything Clayton is showing you as secretary. I've been documenting Meredith's unauthorized actions for weeks. She's been intercepting communications, creating false documentation, and abusing her position to wage a personal vendetta against a homeowner whose only crime was owning a boat she didn't like." The room erupted into chaos. Some residents were demanding Meredith's immediate resignation, while others were shouting questions about what other fake fines and phantom committees might have been used against them. A man stood up and held his HOA notice in the air, yelling, "I paid a $500 fine last year for a bird feeder. Was that even real?" An older couple near the back were in tears, saying they'd almost sold their home. Because of threats from the HOA, one woman looked like she was ready to storm the podium, shouting, "We trusted you, Meredith, you lied to all of us." It wasn't just scandal, it was mutiny. I watched Meredith's carefully constructed authority dissolve in real time as her lies were exposed to the entire community. She tried desperately to regain control, pounding her gavel and demanding order, but the damage was done finally. Meredith grabbed the microphone from my hands and declared the meeting adjourned due to disruption by a hostile resident. But as she rushed toward the exit, at least 20 residents followed her, demanding answers and accountability. I packed up my equipment knowing that everything had changed. The war wasn't over, but I just won the most important battle, the battle for truth, in front of the entire community. 3 days after the explosive HOA meeting, I woke up to my phone buzzing with an emergency notification from the boat security system. The motion sensors had triggered just after dawn, but when I checked the live feed, I couldn't see my boat at all. Panic shot through me like ice water as I threw on clothes and ran down to the community dock, my bare feet slapping against the cold pavement. What I found there will haunt me for the Rest of my life, my beautiful fishing boat, the one I'd saved for years, to buy the one that represented every weekend of freedom and every dollar of hard work, was smashed against the rocky shoreline like a broken toy. The bow was crumpled, the hull was cracked open, and lake water was pouring into the cabin through a gash that ran almost the entire length of the starboard side. $20. 0 of dreams and craftsmanship was dying right in front of my eyes. I waded into the shallow water, not caring that the October lake was cold enough to make my legs go numb. The damage was catastrophic, not just cosmetic scrapes, but structural. Destruction that would cost more to repair than the boat was worth. The captain's chair floated like driftwood, and the steering wheel I used to polish every weekend lay cracked in half beneath the surface. This wasn't an accident or storm damage. This was deliberate destruction. That's when I noticed the dock lines, instead of being properly secured to my boat's cleats, they were floating free in the water, cut clean through with what looked like a sharp knife someone had deliberately set. My boat adrift during the night, knowing the wind and current would drive it straight into the rocks. I stood there in knee-deep, freezing water, holding pieces of my destroyed boat, and feeling something break inside my chest that had nothing to do with fiberglass and metal. The sound of a car door slamming made me look up toward the parking area. Meredith Lowell was climbing out of her white SUV, and I'll never forget the expression on her face. Pure, undisguised satisfaction. She walked down to the dock in her designer shoes and expensive coat, surveying the wreckage like a general admiring a successful bombing raid. When she saw me standing in the water, she actually smiled. "What a terrible accident," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "I heard there was quite a storm last night. Such a shame when people don't properly secure their watercraft." The lies rolled off her tongue so smoothly, but her eyes were sparkling with malicious
joy. I slogged out of the water, my jeans soaked and my boots squelching with every step, feeling rage build in my chest like steam in a pressure cooker. "You did this?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Meredith tilted her head with exaggerated
confusion. "Did what, Clayton?" "I certainly didn't control the weather last night, maybe. If you'd invested in proper dock equipment instead of causing problems for your neighbors, this tragedy could have been avoided." She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of the wreckage, probably already planning her next move in this twisted game. But I'd learned from our previous encounters, even as my heart was breaking over my destroyed boat, I was thinking strategically. I pulled out my own phone and started recording her reaction, capturing her obvious satisfaction and her immediate attempts to blame me for the destruction for the record. "Meredith, you're standing here gloating over thousands of dollars in damage to my personal property, and I want your reaction. Documented." Her smile faltered slightly when she realized I was filming, but she recovered quickly. "I'm simply documenting a safety hazard that resulted from improper boat maintenance. The HOA may need to implement stronger regulations to prevent future incidents like this." She turned away from my camera and walked back toward her SUV, but not before I caught her checking her phone and typing what looked like a text message. Within an hour, that text message became clear. Meredith had posted photos of my wrecked boat on the community forum with a caption about the dangers of improper watercraft storage and why HOA regulations exist to protect everyone. She was actually using the destruction of my property as propaganda to justify her fake authority. The comment section filled up with neighbors expressing sympathy for the terrible accident and praising Meredith for her foresight in trying to prevent exactly this kind of tragedy. I spent the rest of that morning documenting every detail of the damage and the cut dock lines. I took hundreds of photos from every angle, measured the clean cuts in the rope, and collected samples of everything I could find when Deputy Carter arrived in response. To my call, he took one look at the scene and immediately started treating it as a criminal investigation rather than an accident report. These lines were definitely cut, Carter confirmed, examining the rope ends with a magnifying glass. Clean slices, probably made with a sharp knife or razor blade. This was intentional destruction of property. He looked up at me with the same serious expression I'd seen during the boat party incident. Do you have any idea who might have done this? I showed him the security footage from my cameras, which clearly captured someone approaching the dock area around 3 a.m., though the figure stayed in the shadows and avoided the direct camera angles. But the footage also showed Meredith's SUV parked in the community lot at 3:20 a.m., well after any reasonable person would be up and about. She was here, I said, pointing at the timestamp right after someone cut my boat. Luce Carter studied the footage, carefully making notes in his official report. This gives us a timeline and establishes opportunity combined with the pattern of harassment you've documented. We might have enough for criminal charges, but even as he said it, I could see the challenge in his eyes. Proving Meredith had physically cut the lines would require more than circumstantial evidence, and she was smart enough to avoid the cameras. That afternoon, I sat on what was left of my boat's deck, surrounded by soggy cushions and broken equipment, feeling more defeated than I'd felt in years. The boat had been my escape, my pride, my symbol of independence after a difficult divorce. Now it was just expensive debris floating in a lake that no longer felt like home. I called my insurance company, knowing they'd probably classify this as vandalism with an insufficient police report to guarantee coverage. But as the sun set over the lake, something began to change inside me. The grief and shock were giving way to something harder and more focused. Meredith had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She'd moved from harassment and intimidation to actual destruction of my property, and she'd done it with such confidence that she was already spinning it as vindication of her authority. This wasn't just about a boat anymore. It was about justice, and I was going to make sure she got exactly what she deserved. 2 weeks after my boat was destroyed, Meredith called another emergency HOA meeting. The notice claimed that recent security incidents required immediate action to protect community assets and ensure resident safety. I knew she was planning something big. Her previous attacks had been building to this moment, and she was about to make her final move to eliminate me from the neighborhood entirely. The meeting was smaller this time, maybe 30 residents compared to the 60 who'd attended the previous showdown. Word of Meredith's lies had spread through the community, and many people were staying away from the drama. Those who remained were her core supporters, residents who valued order above truth. Meredith stood at the podium projecting competent leadership despite recent chaos with official-looking documents. Displayed behind her on the presentation screen, "Thank you for coming tonight to address a matter of critical importance to our community's safety and financial security." She began, her voice carrying that familiar tone of manufactured crisis. As you know, the destruction of Clayton Reese's watercraft has created both environmental and financial liabilities for our association. Fuel and oil from the wreckage have contaminated community waters, and the debris poses ongoing safety hazards to residents and their children. She clicked through slides showing enlarged photos of oil stains and twisted metal, making the damage look far worse than it actually was. Under emergency provisions of our governing documents, Meredith continued, the board has determined that the wreckage must be classified as abandoned property and removed at community expense. However, Mr. Ree has refused to cooperate with cleanup efforts, leaving the association no choice but to assume responsibility for environmental remediation. Every word was carefully chosen, legal language designed to make her property grab sound reasonable and necessary. I sat in the back row, watching this performance with a mixture of admiration and disgust. Meredith was transforming my destroyed boat into a community liability, creating justification for seizing what remained of my property and probably billing me for the cleanup costs. It was brilliant in its audacity. She was literally adding insult to injury by making me pay for the privilege of having my boat destroyed. The environmental impact assessment indicates cleanup costs of approximately $15. $0, Meredith announced, displaying a professional look report that I was certain she'd fabricated. These costs will be assessed against Mr. Reese's property as a special lien with interest accruing at the maximum rate allowed by state law. If he refuses to pay, the association will pursue foreclosure proceedings to recover our expenses. The room was quiet as residents absorbed the implications. Meredith was essentially threatening to take my house to pay for cleaning up the boat she'd destroyed. It was the kind of legal maneuver that sounded plausible to people who didn't understand property law, and I could see several neighbors nodding in agreement with her, reasoning that I'd been expecting this move and I'd been preparing my counterattack. For days, when Meredith opened the floor for questions, I stood up with a thick folder in my hands. Point of order, Madame President. Before the board votes on any financial assessments, I believe the community should know the truth about what really
happened to my
boat. Mr. Ree, you're out of order, Meredith snapped, but several board members gestured for me to continue. They were clearly uncomfortable with the aggressive tactics she'd been using, and they wanted to hear my side of the story. I walked to the front of the room and placed my folder on the podium, opening it to reveal a stack of documents that would change everything. First, I want to address the environmental impact claims, I said, pulling out official reports from the State Environmental Agency. I had the lake water tested by certified professionals immediately after the incident. There was no fuel spill, no oil contamination, and no environmental damage beyond the visual impact of the wreckage itself. These claims of $15,000 in cleanup costs are completely fabricated. I could see Meredith's face starting to pale as I systematically destroyed her narrative. Second, I want to address the claim that this was an accident caused by improper boat maintenance. I displayed enlarged photos of the cut dock lines, clearly showing the clean knife cuts that had set my boat adrift. This was deliberate sabotage documented by multiple security cameras and investigated by law enforcement as a criminal matter. The room started buzzing with whispered conversations as residents realized they'd been lied to again. But I wasn't finished. Third, I want to address Meredith's authority to make these financial assessments and property seizures. I pulled out copies of our actual HOA governing documents, highlighted and annotated to show the relevant sections. There is no emergency provision that allows the board to seize private property or assess liens without due process and community vote. These are all lies and distortions. Meredith interrupted, trying to regain control of the meeting, but her voice had lost its confident authority. Mr. Ree is simply trying to avoid responsibility for the damage his negligence has caused. She reached for the microphone, but I wasn't finished. Yet finally I said, pulling out the most damaging document in my folder, I want to address the question of who actually destroyed my boat. The room fell silent as I displayed a printed email chain that I'd never seen before this morning. I received these emails from someone who wishes to remain anonymous, someone who's been documenting Meredith's activities for weeks. The emails were devastating. They showed Meredith coordinating with a security consultant to solve the boat problem permanently. There were chilling subject lines like timing for maximum damage and make it look like poor maintenance. One thread showed Meredith discussing weather forecasts to time the sabotage with wind direction. Another included attachments labeled mitigation.
Language with pre-written forum posts blaming me for negligence. It wasn't just conspiracy, it was a script. And the more I read, the more I realized how far she'd gone to stage everything down to the last splash. The anonymous sender had apparently
Been forwarding Meredith messages to create a complete record of the conspiracy. You can't use anonymous sources. Meredith shouted, her composure finally cracking completely. Those emails could be fabricated, they're probably fake. But the damage was done. The residents could see the fear in her eyes, and they could read the detailed planning that had gone into destroying my property. Several people started taking photos of the projected emails with their phones. Rachel McKinley stood up from her seat in the middle of the room. I sent those emails to Clayton, she announced, her voice carrying clearly. Through the stunned silence as HOA secretary, I have access to all official association communications. What you're seeing are real emails from Meredith's association account discussing criminal conspiracy to destroy a resident's property. The meeting dissolved into chaos as residents demanded explanations and accountability. Some were shouting questions at Meredith, while others were calling for her immediate resignation. Through it all, I stood at the podium, watching her carefully constructed authority crumble into dust. She'd pushed me too far, underestimated my determination, and now the entire community could see exactly what kind of person they'd allowed to control their neighborhood. Meredith grabbed her purse and rushed toward the exit, but not before turning back to shout, "This isn't over, Clayton. You have no idea what you've started." The threat echoed through the community center as she fled, leaving behind a room full of residents who were finally beginning to understand the monster they'd created by giving her unchecked power. 3 months after that explosive HOA meeting, I sat in my attorney's office reviewing settlement documents that would have seemed impossible. Just a few weeks earlier, the papers spread across. The mahogany conference table represented complete vindication, not just for me, but for everyone who'd ever been bullied by an out-of-control homeowners association. The investigation that followed Rachel's revelation had been swift and devastating. For Meredith, Deputy Carter's criminal investigation expanded to include the State Attorney General's office when they discovered that Meredith had been embezzling HOA funds to pay for her legal defense. The attorney husband she'd been bragging about turned out to be a paralegal she'd been paying with community money to create fake legal documents and intimidate residents. The settlement breakdown is quite favorable, my lawyer explained, pointing to the itemized list of damages: $200,000 for the boat destruction, $300,000 for harassment and intentional infliction of emotional distress, $200,000 in punitive damages, and $300,000 in attorney fees and court costs. The insurance company settled quickly once they saw the evidence of deliberate criminal activity, but the financial settlement was only part of the victory. The real win was what happened to Meredith herself. The state investigation revealed that she'd stolen over $50,000 in HOA funds, created fraudulent legal documents, and conspired to destroy private property. She was facing felony charges that would likely result in prison time, and her professional reputation was destroyed beyond repair. The morning of the final settlement conference, I drove past Meredith's house and saw the for sale sign planted in her perfectly manicured front yard. The white SUV that had become a symbol of her authority was gone, replaced by a beat-up sedan that probably belonged to whatever family member was helping her pack. Neighbors who had once cowed before her authority were openly gossiping about her downfall, and the community forum was full of residents sharing their own stories of harassment and manipulation at the settlement conference. Meredith looked completely different from the confident executive who'd once controlled every HOA meeting. Gone were the expensive suits and perfect styling. She looked defeated and broken. Her court-appointed attorney spoke First, Mr. Ree, my client would like to make a statement before we finalize this agreement. Meredith looked up at me with what might have been genuine remorse, though it was hard to tell if she was sorry for her actions or just sorry she'd been caught. Clayton, I want you to know that I never intended for things to go this far. I was trying to maintain community standards, and I let my personal feelings cloud my judgment. I'm truly sorry for the damage I caused to your property and your reputation. The apology sounded rehearsed, probably crafted by her attorney to minimize her legal exposure, but there was something in her voice that suggested real regret. I looked across the conference table at this woman who'd made my life hell for months, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Pity, Meredith, you had all the power in the world to make our community better. Instead, you used that power to hurt people and protect your own ego. I accept your apology, but I hope you understand that actions have consequences. The settlement was finalized that afternoon, with Meredith agreeing to pay the full amount and accepting a permanent ban from serving on any homeowners association board. In the state, the court also ordered her to attend anger management counseling and perform 200 hours of community service, preferably in a role where she could learn what real public service looked like. 6 months later, I stood on the dock beside my new boat, a beautiful 30-foot cabin cruiser that was twice the size of the one Meredith had destroyed. The insurance settlement had allowed me to upgrade significantly, and the legal victory had given me the confidence to fully enjoy my life on the lake again. The boat was named Justice, served a reminder that sometimes fighting back against bullies actually works. The community had transformed as well. Rachel McKinley had been elected as the new HOA president, running on a platform of transparency and accountability that resonated with residents who were tired of authoritarian leadership. One of her first acts was to establish a resident Bill of Rights that protected homeowners from arbitrary fines and harassment. The fake committees that Meredith had created were dissolved, and all of her fraudulent regulations were officially repealed. Stanley knocked on my door that evening, carrying his usual offering of cold beer and good conversation. Heard Meredith finally moved out yesterday, he said, settling into the porch chair with satisfaction. Saw the moving truck loading up her stuff. Neighbors were actually cheering when she drove away. For the last time we sat on my porch, watching the sunset reflect off the lake, both of us marveling at how much had changed since that first $500 fine
had appeared on my door. You know what the best part is? I asked, taking a sip of beer and smiling at the peaceful scene in front of us. It's not the money or even seeing her get what she deserved. It's knowing that she can't hurt anyone else the
way she tried to hurt me. A young boy from down the street rode his bicycle past my house, slowing down to stare at my new boat. With obvious admiration, "Mister, is that your boat?" "It's awesome," he called out, his face bright, with the kind of enthusiasm that only kids can manage. I waved back and called out, "Thanks, buddy. Maybe I'll take you fishing sometime if your parents say it's okay." As the boy rode away, I realized that this was what community was supposed to feel like. Neighbors looking out for each other, kids feeling safe to talk to adults, and everyone working together to make their neighborhood better. Meredith's reign of fear and intimidation was over, replaced by something healthier and more sustainable. The final twist came 3 months later when I received a letter from the State Attorney General's office. They were implementing new regulations for homeowners associations statewide inspired by the abuses they discovered in our case. The Lakewood Hills Reform Act would require all HOA boards to undergo annual training in property law and conflict resolution, establish clear appeals processes for fines and violations, and create independent oversight for communities with histories of management problems. I framed that letter and hung it in my home office right next to the settlement agreement, and a photo of my destroyed boat They served as reminders that justice sometimes takes time, but it's worth fighting for. Meredith Lowell had tried to destroy my life over a boat, but in the end, her actions had led to reforms that would protect thousands of homeowners from similar abuse on quiet evenings. When I'm out on the lake with my new boat, I sometimes think about what would have happened if I just paid that first $500 fine and tried to avoid conflict. Meredith would have moved on to her next victim, and her pattern of abuse would have continued, unchecked instead. By standing up for myself and fighting back with evidence and determination, I'd helped create a better world for everyone in my community. The boat's engine purrs smoothly as I navigate toward the setting sun, and I can't help but smile at the irony. Meredith had hated my boat so much that she'd committed felonies trying to get rid of it. Now I have a bigger, better boat, $1 million settlement, and the satisfaction of knowing that her abuse of power led directly to her own downfall sometimes.